History often paints a polished picture of progress and unity, but underneath that surface are unbelievable, harrowing stories that were deliberately hidden for decades. This is the story of the Slocum Massacre. Slocum, Texas, an unassuming community where an explosion of racial hatred turned a quiet town into a battleground of terror. What happened here in July 1910 wasn't just a sad tragedy, but an atrocity. A massacre that left countless black men, women, and children dead, their blood soaking the soil of their homes. It wasn't just the magnitude of the violence that shocked the conscience, but the unadulterated brutality of it. Innocent people were hunted down like animals, gunned down as they ran for their lives. Homes were burned, families instantly torn apart, and a vibrant and thriving black community was wiped away from the map. This vicious act did not happen by mistake, but was a deliberate and coordinated act of terror. Yet despite the intensity of this horror, the Slocum Massacre is a chapter that most history books refuse to acknowledge. It's a story that has been buried under layers of denial, removed from the official records of Texas and the United States, as if the lives that were lost were not worth remembering. The truth is, the Slocum Massacre wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of racial violence that was designed to instill fear and suppress the civil rights and progress of blacks. Thriving black communities were being systematically destroyed across the country, and Slocum became yet another example of the lengths some would go to maintain white supremacy. Imagine this. It's a sweltering summer day in 1910. Black residents in Slocum are going about their lives. Some work on their land, run their businesses, raise their children, and carry out various activities. Then, without warning, a mob of armed white men invades the community. They came with rifles, pistols, and shotguns. Their faces were twisted with hate. They don't ask questions. They don't issue warnings. They simply kill indiscriminately and without mercy. Witnesses later described men being shot as they tried to hide in the woods. Women and children weren't spared either. The bodies of the dead were littered all over the ground. Their lives came to an end in an instant. One survivor who trembled in fear later recounts how the mob showed no remorse, no hesitation. "They hunted us like we were animals," they said. And when the slaughter was over, the survivors were forced to flee, leaving everything they had worked for behind. For over a century, this dark chapter was suppressed. Local newspapers at the time claimed the violence was justified, painting the black community as the aggressor. Meanwhile, it was only a tactic that is too familiar in cases of racial violence. No one was ever held accountable, justice was never served, and the victims' stories were left to fade into obscurity. In this video, we'll ensure that this story is no longer forgotten. We will revisit the truth of what happened in Slocum, Texas in July 1910, not just to recount the events, but to honor the lives that were lost, uncover the lasting scars, and confront the deep-rooted hatred that led to such dark atrocity. In the early 1900s, America was a nation of direct opposite to what you see it as now. It was a total stark contrast. The country boasted of prosperity and progress in some sectors while struggling with deeply entrenched racial divisions in others. This was even more evident in the South compared to other locations, because Jim Crow laws were more dominant in the South, and black communities lived under the constant shadow of oppression. To understand the Slocum Massacre of 1910, let's explore the powder keg of racial tension that existed at the time and how it affected the lives of those in Slocum, Texas. The early 19th and early 20th centuries saw significant strides in industry and innovation, but life remained a battle for basic human dignity for black Americans. The Reconstruction period following the Civil War had ended in 1877, leaving black communities vulnerable as federal protections had gradually worn away. The resurgence of white supremacy manifested in laws, policies, and practices designed to disenfranchise and oppress black citizens across the South. Like much of the South, black Americans were systematically excluded from political power, economic opportunities, and education in Texas. Jim Crow laws reinforced segregation, which created a society where black people were considered second-class citizens. Schools, public spaces, transportation, and even drinking fountains were separate and far from equal. Between 1880 and 1930, thousands of lynchings took place. with Texas being among the states that had the highest figures. These horrific acts were often celebrated by the local white populations, further highlighting the dehumanization of black lives. Slocum was a small, unincorporated community in Anderson County, Texas. This community was no exception to this broader racial dynamic. By 1910, Slocum was a rural settlement that was populated by farmers, laborers, and traders. Among its residents were an increasing number of black families who were beginning to build a good life for themselves despite the odds that stood against them. Black residents in Slocum were known for their industrious and hardworking attributes. They worked the land, owned property, and ran businesses, gradually building a foundation of economic stability. This success symbolized hope for many. A future where they could provide for their families and contribute to their communities. However, this success did not come without consequences. The prosperity of black residents was often perceived as a threat to their white neighbors. Stories of hard-working black families acquiring land or wealth became a subject of jealousy and resentment. A toxic narrative began to spread. Black people didn't know their place and were disrupting the status quo. Economic disparities only made this tension more intense. The predominantly white elite in Texas was in control of most of the wealth, yet even modest achievements by black families were seen as challenges to white dominance. This pervasive attitude created an environment where violence against black communities could erupt at the slightest provocation. The intense racism of the era went far beyond interpersonal prejudices. The legal system, local governance, and law enforcement were all tools used to maintain white supremacy. Black citizens in Slocum and similar towns experienced immense barriers to justice. Laws were enforced selectively, often punishing black residents more severely than their white colleagues for the same offenses, or punishing them for crimes that did not exist. Police and local officials frequently turned a blind eye to violence against black citizens, if not actively participating in it. This imbalance created a society where black people were left vulnerable, unable to trust the very systems that were supposed to protect them. Rumors, often unfounded but deadly in their consequences, made matters even worse. Stories of supposed black progress and developmental or violent plots against white communities spread like wildfire across the South. These baseless rumors were enough to spark mob violence, leading to countless tragedies like the Slocum Massacre. By 1910, tensions in Slocum had reached a boiling point. The successes of black residents were no longer just a quiet source of envy. They were perceived as a direct challenge to the white authority. Local whites began to circulate rumors of a potential black insurrection. Though this narrative was entirely fabricated, tapped into the deep-seated fears of white residents who saw their dominance slipping away. At the same time, black families in Slocum were simply trying to live their normal lives. They worked tirelessly to provide for their children and establish a sense of security in an uncertain world. But even their modest dreams were seen as provocations in a society that was bent on suppressing them. The stage was set for an unforgettable tragedy. The toxic combination of systemic oppression, economic jealousy, and fear created a volatile environment where the slightest spark could ignite a firestorm. Like this video and subscribe to this channel as we journey further to understand the Slocum Massacre and recount the events of that fateful day. As we delve further into this dark chapter of history, it's important to remember the people at the heart of this story. They were more than victims of violence. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and dignity, living in a society that sought to deny them all three. In the early summer of 1910, the air in East Texas felt heavy and tense. Families who had worked hard to carve out a slice of prosperity in a land that was characterized by systemic oppression were now living in uneasy peace with their white neighbors. But beneath the surface, jealousy and fear lingered, a cauldron waiting to boil over. The root of the massacre was the growing success of black residents in Slocum. At the time, this was a dangerous position for any black community to hold. Many black families in Slocum were striving for economic independence. This defied the societal norms imposed by the Jim Crow South, where black people were expected to remain subservient and dependent. White residents perceived this success with suspicion and resentment. The prosperity of the black community was not just a threat to their economic dominance, but was an affront to the racial hierarchy that governed every aspect of Southern life. Whispered conversations in general stores, glances exchanged at church gatherings, and muttered grievances began to grow into something far more menacing. By July 1910, the tensions reached a breaking point. Rumors began to spread wild, baseless claims that the black residents of Slocum were planning an armed uprising. The origins of these rumors remain unclear, but their impact was significantly felt. Stories of stockpiles of weapons and secret meetings rapidly spread with alarming speed, fueled by paranoia and racial animosity. The specific spark that ignited the massacre can be traced to a seemingly mundane event, a business disagreement. A black man, Abe Wilson by name, had been engaged in a financial transaction with a white man. The details of the dispute have been lost to history, but what is known is that the altercation escalated beyond words. The white man's anger quickly turned into a rallying cry, one that was eagerly taken up by others in the community. In the racially charged environment of the time, a simple disagreement was all it took to justify violence against the black community. Wilson simply standing up for himself in the dispute was perceived as defiance. This was enough to enrage local whites. Soon, whispers of his supposed insolence transformed into accusations of a broader conspiracy, feeding the growing hysteria. If there was any hope of diffusing the situation, it was extinguished by the actions or inaction of local authorities. Instead of calming tensions, they added fuel to the flames. Local officials who were influenced by the same racial prejudices as the mob lent credence to the baseless rumors of an uprising. Reports suggest that some officials even encouraged white residents to defend themselves against the supposed threat. Sheriff William H. Black, a key figure in Anderson County, issued inflammatory statements that further escalated the situation. His words were far from being a call for peace and became a rallying cry for violence. It didn't take long for this delusional disorder to metamorphose into outright violence. White residents began arming themselves, forming impromptu militias, and roaming the countryside in search of evidence of the alleged uprising. The mere sight of black men traveling on the roads was enough to spark a confrontation. One account narrates of a young black man who was stopped by a group of armed whites. When he denied knowing of any conspiracy, he was beaten and left dead. Such incidents became commonplace in the days leading up to the massacre, creating an atmosphere of terror among black residents. The black community in Slocum was not oblivious to the growing danger. Many residents had heard the rumors and seen the warning signs. Some fled, leaving behind their homes and belongings in the hope of finding safety in a different community. Others tried to stay, with the belief or perhaps hoping that reason would prevail. As the fateful day drew nigh, the tension in Slocum was more palpable. Black residents were warned to stay indoors or leave town entirely. The streets became abnormally quiet as fear gripped the community. Meanwhile, white residents gathered in groups, their conversations punctuated by the ominous clatter of rifles and shotguns being loaded. A narrative has it that a local black pastor spoke to his congregation, urging them to remain calm and pray for peace. His words were meant to reassure, but they betrayed his uncertainty. Just like many others, he understood that prayer alone might not be enough to stop what was coming. On the evening of July 29, 1910, the powder keg finally exploded. Accounts vary as to what happened, but many point to a confrontation between a group of armed whites and a black resident who was accused of threatening violence. The details of the encounter are hidden in the chaos of the time, but the outcome was clear. The white mob used the incident as a justification to unleash their fury. Within hours, the violence had spread like wildfire. Armed groups of white men descended upon the black community, targeting homes, businesses, and individuals with ruthless efficiency. The massacre had begun, and there was no turning back. What makes this event particularly chilling is the psychology behind it. The mob's actions were not the result of a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of years of systemic racism, economic envy, and social conditioning. The fear of an armed black uprising was a convenient excuse, but the underlying motive was clear: to reassert white dominance and crush any atom of black progress. This mentality was not unique to Slocum. Across the South, similar massacres occurred whenever black communities dared to defy the status quo. As the first shots were fired, the mob's frenzy reached a fever pitch. Families were forced to flee into the woods, abandoning their homes and livelihoods in a desperate bid to survive. Those who couldn't escape met unspeakable brutality. The exact number of lives that were lost remains uncertain, but estimates suggest that dozens, if not hundreds, of black residents were killed in the massacre. Survivors later recounted harrowing stories of hiding in swamps and forests, listening to the sounds of gunfire and screams as the mob tore through their community. The events of the Slocum Massacre unfolded with a terrifying precision that betrayed their spontaneous appearance. While the violence erupted seemingly without warning, its orchestration and execution revealed a darker truth. This was not a random outburst of chaos, but a calculated act of terror designed to victimize the black community in Slocum. That fateful day, around mid-morning of July 29, 1910, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Groups of armed white men were spotted gathering along the roads leading into Slocum. Their presence, though intimidating, was not entirely unexpected. For days, these groups had been patrolling the area under the guise of self-defense. That morning, however, their intentions were far more evil. As the hours passed by, the population increased in size. White men from neighboring towns joined the gathering, armed with different forms of ammunition. The sheer number of armed men was estimated to be in the hundreds. This number was enough to send waves of fear through the black community. Those who had doubted the rumors of violence now faced the harsh reality that their lives were in extreme danger. Early in the afternoon, the situation reached a boiling point. Historians suggest that an armed group of whites encountered a black man on a rural road. The confrontation escalated quickly, and shots were fired. This initial violence was a signal, unleashing a torrent of coordinated attacks against the black residents of Slocum. Within minutes, the roads that led into town became killing fields. Armed whites roamed the countryside, targeting anyone they came across. Homes were set ablaze, families were dragged from their houses, and those who tried to flee were hunted down. The attacks were indiscriminate, sparing neither the elderly nor children. For many black residents, survival depended on quick thinking and the courage to face the unknown. One survivor, whose account was recorded several years later, recalled the moment she and her family fled away from their home. "We heard them coming," she said. "The sound of horses' hooves and men shouting. My father grabbed us and told us to run. We didn't have time to pack anything. Not food, not clothes, just run." She and her siblings stumbled into the thick woods behind their house, barefoot and afraid. For hours, they stayed in silence, hearing gunfire and screams in the distance. "We didn't know if we'd ever see each other again," she recounted. "The fear was like nothing I've ever felt before." For days, this family survived on berries and stream water, moving only at night to avoid detection. When they finally emerged, their home was reduced to ashes, and the community they used to know was gone. One story that has been spread is about a man named Isaac Daniels, who was a farmer and father of 3. Daniels was known in Slocum as a man of principle, a hard worker who had earned the respect of both black and white residents. On the day of the massacre, Daniels sent his family into hiding, knowing full well the danger that stands before them. But instead of fleeing with them, he stayed behind. He was determined to protect their home and livelihood. Daniels took up a position near his barn and was armed with nothing but an old hunting rifle. When the mob arrived, they demanded that Daniels leave. "This land is ours now," one of them reportedly shouted. Daniels refused, standing his ground even as the mob grew more hostile and aggressive. Some witnesses later recounted that Daniels fired a single warning shot into the air. The mob responded with a hail of bullets, killing him on the spot. His body was left where it fell as a grim message to anyone who dared to resist. The massacre showed mercy to no one, not even the youngest and most vulnerable personality. One particular story that breaks the heart is the account of a young boy who witnessed the horrors firsthand. At just 10 years old, he had to watch as his family was torn apart. "They came to our house at night," he later recounted. "They were yelling and shooting. My mama told me to hide under the bed and not make a sound." The boy saw his father dragged outside and beaten from his hiding place. His mother tried to intervene, only for her to be struck down. "I wanted to scream, but I couldn't," he said. "I just stayed there, shaking, wishing it was all a bad dream." The boy eventually ran into the woods, where he wandered alone for days before being found by a sympathetic family in a neighboring town. Though he survived, the trauma of that night lasted with him for the rest of his life. The women of Slocum displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable violence. One of such women, who is known only as Sarah, became a symbol of resilience for her community. When the mob reached Sarah's home, they set it on fire, forcing her and her children to leave. But Sarah refused to leave empty-handed. As flames consumed her house, she ran back inside to retrieve a family Bible, a symbol of her faith and heritage. Emerging from the smoke with her children and the Bible in hand, Sarah led her family into the woods. For weeks she kept them alive, relying on her knowledge of the land to find food and water. Years later, Sarah's descendants would preserve that same Bible as a testament to her strength and determination. Many of the massacre's victims were buried in hastily dug graves. Their names and stories were lost to history. For their families, the pain of losing loved ones was compounded by the inability to grieve publicly. One woman, whose husband and son were killed during the massacre, spoke of how isolated she felt in the aftermath. "I couldn't even cry where people could see me," she said. "They'd think I was causing trouble, so I cried in secret every night until there were no tears left." This forced silence was emblematic of the larger societal effort to erase the massacre from memory. Families were left to mourn their grief, overshadowed by the fear of further retaliation in private. Despite the efforts to silence them, the survivors of the Slocum Massacre found ways to preserve their stories. Oral histories became a lifeline that ensured that the memories of those who were lost would not fade away. One elderly woman, speaking decades after the massacre, described the importance of sharing these stories with the younger generation. She said, "We have to tell it, not because it's easy, but because it's true. If we don't, they'll pretend it never happened." These stories, though painful, have become a vital part of the community's identity. The event is a reminder of the horrors of the past and a call to action for the future. These stories of the Slocum Massacre's victims are not just tales of suffering, they are also stories of resilience, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Each story, whether it ends in tragedy or survival, adds another layer to our understanding of this dark chapter in history. Their stories remind us that history is not just a series of events. It is the lived experience of real people, each with their dreams, fears, and hopes. In telling these stories, we ensure that the victims of the Slocum Massacre are not forgotten. Their voices that have been silenced in life speak to us through the echoes of time, urging us to remember, to learn, and to strive for a future where such atrocities never occur again. The Slocum Massacre was not just the result of individual prejudice. It was aggravated by the collective power of mob mentality. This psychological phenomenon occurs when individuals in a group abandon personal responsibility and adopt a shared mindset that is often extreme. It transforms ordinary people into perpetrators of unspeakable violence and creates a dangerous environment where accountability is drowned out by the overwhelming influence of the group. In Slocum, mob mentality was caused by a combination of racial fear, economic anxiety, and enduring prejudices. Rumors of a supposed black uprising, though entirely baseless, spread rapidly and ignited paranoia among the white population. Individuals began to band together with a conviction that they were acting in self-defense or preserving the social order. This was fueled by fear and misinformation. Mob mentality also thrives on dehumanization. It was a critical factor in the Slocum Massacre. The mob saw black residents as threats to be eliminated rather than neighbors or individuals. This dehumanization made it easier for participants to justify their actions, convincing themselves that they were protecting their community rather than destroying it. Another aspect of mob mentality is the suppression of dissent. Those who might have objected to the violence were forced to remain silent, either out of fear of becoming targets themselves or due to the overwhelming pressure to conform. In Slocum, the few voices of reason were drowned out by the mob's collective roar, ensuring that the violence continued at full strength. The role of mob mentality in the Slocum Massacre highlights the dangers of unchecked groupthink and the power of fear to override individual morality. It is a stark reminder of how ordinary people can easily become complicit in extraordinary violence when swept up by the tides of collective uncontrolled behavioral exhibits. The events of those horrific days had transformed the town into a dark town. The event turned what was once a vibrant Black community into a ghost of its former self. For Black residents who survived the massacre, the priority was to survive. Many families fled, leaving behind their homes, possessions, and land. Many walked for miles to neighboring towns, carrying only what they could hold. Some found refuge with relatives or sympathetic communities, while others were forced to start a new life with nothing but the clothes on their bodies. Survivors carried the weight of trauma with them, being haunted by memories of violence and loss. Many never returned to Slocum because of the fear of further retaliation or unable to bear the pain of revisiting the place where their lives were torn apart. The physical structure of Slocum bore the marks of the massacre. These acts were calculated efforts to erase the Black presence from the town. The white perpetrators of the massacre quickly seized the opportunity to claim abandoned land, strengthening their control over the community. This economic exploitation was a continuation of the violence that ensured that Black families lost their lives and also their livelihoods. The failure of the justice system of the time was one of the most devastating aspects of the aftermath. Efforts to hold the perpetrators accountable were half-hearted at best, while reports of the massacre reached state and national levels. A grand jury convened to investigate the massacre, and several white men were arrested. However, none were ever convicted. Witnesses were too terrified to testify, and the pervasive racism of the era ensured that even the most obvious evidence was ignored. The message was clear: the lives of Black residents were expendable, and their killers would face no consequences. This failure of justice emboldened those who believed that such acts of violence could be committed with impunity. In the immediate aftermath, the story of the Slocum Massacre was deliberately silenced. Local newspapers undermined the violence, describing it as a riot and implying that Black residents were at fault. This narrative erased their experiences and perpetuated the lie that the massacre was justified. Survivors and their descendants were often reluctant to speak publicly about what had happened, fearing retaliation or stigma. This silence created a void in the historical record, which allowed the massacre to fade from the memory of the public for decades. The trauma of the Slocum Massacre had long-lasting effects on its survivors. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though such conditions were poorly understood at the time. Children who witnessed the violence grew up with the knowledge of this horrible experience they had seen that shattered their innocence. Adults struggled to rebuild their lives, often facing ongoing discrimination and economic hardship. For many, the massacre was not just a singular event, but the beginning of a lifetime of struggle. The immediate aftermath of the Slocum Massacre showcased the broader societal failure to confront and address racial violence. The nation missed an opportunity to reckon with its history and prevent future atrocities by refusing to acknowledge the truth. Instead, the cycle of violence and injustice continued, allowing communities like Slocum to bear the brunt of its consequences. This economic loss was devastating. Black families who had worked tirelessly and relentlessly to build their lives from scratch were left with nothing to show for it. The generational wealth they could have passed on to their children and grandchildren was taken away, creating a cycle of poverty. For many descendants of the victims, the economic impact of the massacre is still very much felt today, and reflected in disparities in property ownership and financial security. The loss of such communities had broad consequences across the country. Events like the Slocum Massacre served as warnings to other Black communities, reinforcing fear and distrust. Many Black families, even in other regions, curtailed their ambitions, knowing that success could make them targets for white resentment and violence. The erasure of this massacre remains one of the most egregious aspects of the event. It denied justice to the victims and allowed the perpetrators to escape accountability. It also robbed future generations of the opportunity to learn from the past. Without widespread acknowledgement of what happened, the conditions that allowed the massacre to occur remained unaddressed, which gave room to the continuation of racial violence in America. The fear and inequality that were created by events like the Slocum Massacre continued to influence policies and attitudes. Discriminatory laws, unequal access to education and employment, and the systematic disenfranchisement of Black Americans were all reinforced by the culture of racial terror that the massacre caused. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to shed light on the Slocum Massacre and other similar events in American history. Historians, activists, and descendants of the victims have worked tirelessly and relentlessly to uncover the truth and demand recognition. In 2011, more than a century after the massacre, the state of Texas finally acknowledged the events, erecting a historical marker near the site of the violence. While this was a significant step, it was only a small gesture compared to the enormity of the tragedy. However, true justice would involve not only acknowledgement, but also reparations for the descendants of the victims and systemic changes to address the ongoing effects of racial inequality. Despite the devastation wrought by the Slocum Massacre, survivors and their descendants have fought to preserve their history and reclaim the true narrative. The Slocum Massacre isn't just a story from the past, but a mirror that reflects the ongoing struggles of racial inequality in America. The consequences of this event transcend through generations, manifesting in economic disparities, social exclusion, and the erasure of Black contributions to society. While we cannot change the past, we can choose how we honor it. Reinvestigating the Slocum Massacre is a step toward justice. Not the kind that comes with courtrooms and verdicts, but the justice of acknowledgement and remembrance. It's about giving a voice to those who were silenced and ensuring their stories are not lost to time. If we are to heal, we must first confront the wounds that have been ignored for far too long. The Slocum Massacre is one of many, but by shining a light on this tragedy, we honor all who have suffered under the weight of injustice. And so, as we uncover the truths of Slocum and other forgotten stories, let us carry forward a commitment to change. Let us confront America's dark past, not to dwell in shame, but to pave the way for a brighter, more equitable future. Because the only way to break free from the shadows of history is to face them head-on, until the narrative changes for good.